It started with a letter. Not a bill, not a postcard from some distant friend or relative, but a formal, cream-colored envelope tucked neatly under the front doormat of a house that had only just begun to feel like home. The handwriting was sharp, almost aggressively cursive, as though each stroke of the pen had been an exercise in control. There was no return address, only the word, "Welcome," written across the flap in a way that didn't feel like a greeting so much as a command. The house itself was a modest lakeside property, perched at the edge of a community that prided itself on peace, order, and unobstructed sunset views. The lake was the centerpiece, a smooth sheet of water reflecting the neighborhood's carefully manicured lawns and symmetrical rows of ornamental trees. It wasn't technically within the Homeowners Association that governed most of the properties around the lake. This particular house stood just outside the invisible boundary, a leftover from before the HOA expanded its reach. That detail, though minor on paper, would turn out to be the single most important factor in what followed. Inside the envelope was a letter printed on thick stationery, embossed with the seal of the Lakeside Harmony Homeowners Association. It began with a syrupy welcome, congratulating the new owner on joining the vibrant community around the lake, and continued with what it framed as an invitation to become a member of the HOA. The terms were laid out plainly: a monthly fee, access to the community events, the right to use the shared dock, and, most importantly, adherence to their rules. It was written as though this membership was both inevitable and necessary, something everyone else had already agreed to without question. For most people, such a letter would have been shrugged off or politely declined. But this neighborhood had someone else, someone who took these letters personally. Her name was Eleanor, though few called her that. To everyone on the street, she was simply Karen, a title she had earned not just by temperament but by her relentless pursuit of conformity. Eleanor chaired the HOA with the fervor of a small-town sheriff, her influence extending far beyond the lines on any map. Her lawn was immaculate, her porch always staged as if for a catalog photo, and her eyes ever watchful for any sign of deviation. When the new homeowner did not respond to the letter, a second arrived, this one less warm and more insistent. It mentioned community cohesion, responsibility to shared resources, and the importance of participation to preserve property values. A third letter followed a week later, this one carrying the faintest edge of a threat, references to past conflicts resolved, unfavorably, for those who refused cooperation. Still, no membership was purchased. No forms were signed. The house remained a free agent, untethered to the web of fees, fines, and endless rules that the HOA thrived upon. And this, for Eleanor, was unacceptable. She began to appear, first at the edge of the driveway with a forced smile and her little dog tucked under her arm, then later on the porch, leaving pamphlets that extolled the virtues of shared responsibility, and the sense of belonging that came from being part of the association. Her voice, though sugar-coated, carried an undercurrent of command, and her compliments always sounded like warnings in disguise. Soon, the invitations turned into demands. Notes appeared taped to the door with highlighted text and underlined phrases: mandatory meeting, final notice, non-compliance issues may result in escalation. It was clear now that this was no longer about a simple choice to join or not. It had become a matter of dominance. The refusal to join was seen as defiance, a challenge to her authority over the neighborhood she believed was hers to govern. What made matters worse, at least in Eleanor's eyes, was the way the new homeowner carried on. The lawn was kept neat enough but not obsessively so. There was no overgrown hedge, no broken-down car on the curb, just an ordinary, well-kept property that happened to be independent. Independence, to her, was an infection that could spread if left unchecked. Others might start asking questions. Others might wonder why they were paying monthly dues while someone else enjoyed the same view for free. And so, the campaign escalated. She began making rounds, whispering to neighbors that the new resident was causing trouble. She hinted at code violations that didn't exist, spoke vaguely of unsanctioned activities, and made it known that she was handling the situation. Some neighbors nodded along, either too polite or too wary to question her. Others simply avoided eye contact when passing by the house, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. The final straw came one quiet Saturday morning, when Eleanor marched across the lawn accompanied by two other board members, clipboards in hand, and delivered what she called a compliance notice. It was, in reality, a list of completely fabricated infractions: a fence supposedly built too high, a boat trailer, improperly stored, and even an accusation of unauthorized lake access, this despite the fact that the dock closest to the house had never been used. The notice came with an ultimatum: join the HOA immediately, pay the initiation fee, or face further action. There was no mistaking the tone now. It was a threat dressed as bureaucracy. But the homeowner did not budge. The notice was ignored, the letters went unanswered, and the porch remained free of their pamphlets, tossed instead into the recycling bin with each delivery. To any outsider, it might have seemed like the end of the matter. After all, what could they really do? The property was outside their jurisdiction, and the law, however tedious, was on the homeowner's side. Eleanor, however, was not one to accept limits. Her pride was on the line, and so was her reputation as the iron-fisted keeper of the lake. And when pride mixes with power, even the smallest act of defiance can spark something far larger. Late one evening, the flashing blue and red lights of a patrol car reflected off the calm waters of the lake. Tires crunched on gravel as officers stepped out, their hands resting casually near their belts. A call had been made, one claiming trespassing, unauthorized use of community property, and potential vandalism. The report, as it turned out, came from none other than Eleanor herself. It was no longer a matter of letters and notices. It had become official, and that was only the beginning. The patrol car had left, its tires crunching over the gravel road as the flashing lights faded into the distance, but the echo of that night remained long after the officers were gone. It was not just the intrusion of law enforcement into a quiet, lawful life, it was the declaration of war from a neighbor who refused to accept limits to her authority. Eleanor, the self-appointed gatekeeper of the lakeside HOA, had shown her hand, and she had no intention of folding. The following week was marked by an eerie, watchful silence. The house at the end of the lane carried on as it always had, lawns trimmed, porch swept, property maintained, but there was a new edge to every movement in the neighborhood. Cars slowed slightly when passing. Conversations stopped just out of earshot. People who had once waved now turned their heads quickly, pretending to be distracted by something else. The effect was subtle, but deliberate. Eleanor's influence was being felt. Behind that influence was a series of small but calculated actions. The HOA newsletter, usually filled with banal notes about community barbecues and seasonal decorations, featured a vague article about non-cooperative residents, putting the shared harmony of the lake at risk. It named no one, but everyone who read it could guess to whom it referred. Words like selfish, non-contributing, and liability were sprinkled throughout, like bait for gossip. Soon after, the HOA installed new signage near the lake access points, declaring them members-only areas. It was a hollow gesture, one that held no legal weight for the property in question, but it was a message all the same. The signs were bright, freshly printed, and strategically placed where every walker, jogger, and dog owner could see them. It created an illusion that the homeowner was violating something, even though no such rule applied. Then came the accusations, subtle at first, then increasingly bold. A neighbor mentioned seeing suspicious activity near the dock at night, nothing proven, just a passing comment at a board meeting that Eleanor happened to emphasize. Another claimed there had been unauthorized use of HOA-maintained land, citing tire tracks near a path that had been there long before the HOA ever claimed it as its own. Each accusation, no matter how flimsy, added to the narrative being built, that the lone house on the edge of the lake was a problem, a thorn in the HOA's side that must be removed or subdued. Letters arrived again, this time worded with sharper language. They spoke of fines that could not legally be imposed, hearings that held no jurisdiction, and final opportunities to avoid escalation. The paper trail grew thick with empty threats, each one filed away, each one a testament to a campaign of persistence. Neighbors, once neutral or indifferent, began to whisper when passing by. Some were fully convinced by Eleanor's version of events, others simply feared her and chose the path of least resistance, pretending to share her concerns rather than risk her scrutiny. After all, she had made examples of others before. The family fined into submission over their unauthorized garden shed, the retired couple forced to repaint their home after a single off-white panel offended the board's sense of uniformity. Everyone knew her methods. No one wanted to be next. The tension reached its peak when a formal complaint was filed, not with the HOA, but with the county. Eleanor had claimed that the property was operating as an unregistered rental, citing fabricated, increased traffic, and unfamiliar visitors. Inspectors arrived, walking the grounds with clipboards, their questions polite but precise. They found nothing, of course. The home was exactly what it appeared to be, a single-family dwelling, properly registered, quietly maintained. But the inconvenience was the point. Eleanor was not trying to win in court or by law, she was trying to exhaust. Every visit, every letter, every rumor planted was another drop in the bucket of irritation, another inch of pressure meant to wear down resistance until surrender felt easier than standing ground. Still, the house remained independent. No fees paid, no forms signed, the dock remained untouched, the lights on at night, the blinds occasionally shifting as if to keep a quiet watch over the lake that had become the center of so much unwanted attention. And so, Eleanor escalated yet again. On a blustery autumn morning, a new notice appeared on the door, this one marked in bold red ink, "Noncompliance escalation, legal proceedings pending." It was entirely fabricated, of course, a bluff dressed in official formatting. It threatened liens, lawsuits, and even property seizure, none of which the HOA had any actual authority to enforce over land outside its covenant. Yet its appearance sent a clear message: the fight was no longer a dispute over an invitation. It was a full campaign of control. The homeowner documented everything now, photographs of each notice, recordings of every conversation from the edge of the driveway, even timestamps of when Eleanor parked her car suspiciously close to the mailbox to peer at incoming mail. The file grew thick, a silent arsenal of evidence that would one day be needed. As fall deepened, the lake grew cold, the trees along the shore shedding their leaves into the water like a warning of storms ahead. The HOA, under Eleanor's relentless push, scheduled an emergency meeting about external property interference and preservation of community standards. It was no longer about one house, it was about a narrative she had built, a threat to the very identity of the neighborhood she claimed to protect. But beneath the noise, the law was unmoved. County officials, when pressed, reiterated what had been true all along: the property was private, its rights intact, its owner within full legal standing to decline any and all HOA involvement. The HOA, in its zeal, had begun to drift dangerously close to harassment, a line that Eleanor seemed either unaware of or unconcerned by. And then, in a moment that would mark the turning point of the entire ordeal, the homeowner pushed back, not with force, but with paperwork of their own. Letters were drafted, not to the HOA, but to the county, to the state attorney general's office, and to the local press. The story, once whispered in cul-de-sacs and over backyard fences, began to stretch beyond the confines of the lake. Eleanor did not take this well. The following morning, a row of cars lined the street, board members, a notary, and Eleanor herself, standing stiffly with a folder in her arms. It was clear that the fight was about to change. This was no longer about persuasion or intimidation. This was the moment she would either break her opponent, or overplay her hand for all to see. The lake that day was still, but the neighborhood felt like a storm about to break. The autumn air had grown sharper, the lake now a mirror of slate-gray skies and bare branches bending in the wind. The rows of parked cars that lined the narrow road that morning were not a coincidence. It was a display, a show of force orchestrated by Eleanor to send a message to the entire neighborhood. Her board members arrived with their clipboards, folders clutched tightly like weapons of bureaucracy. A notary stood awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, brought in to give the illusion of formality to a proceeding that had no legal foundation. The plan, as the papers in her folder revealed, was an attempt at forced annexation, an absurd maneuver in which the HOA intended to vote in the property despite its exclusion from their founding charter. The tactic had been whispered about before, used in smaller, less noticeable ways when residents were too timid or too weary to resist. But this was different. This house had become a symbol, and its owner was no longer silent. As the small assembly gathered at the end of the driveway, neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their curiosity battling with their fear of being seen as disloyal. Some had grown weary of Eleanor's campaign, their patience thinned by the constant letters, meetings, and whispered warnings. Others still clung to her promises of order and property value preservation, unsure where truth ended and manipulation began. The air was heavy with expectation, and for the first time, cracks in her control began to show. What Eleanor had not counted on was the preparation that had been unfolding quietly over the past weeks. Every letter she had sent, every fabricated violation, every threatening notice had been documented meticulously. Copies of property deeds, county maps, and official correspondence sat in a neat folder of their own, one that painted a very different picture than the one she had tried to craft. When the so-called meeting began, her demands were laid out with the same self-assured tone she had wielded for years. She spoke of mandatory inclusion, of retroactive dues, and of disciplinary actions that would follow if resistance continued. But for all her words, her foundation was paper thin. That morning, the first ripple of her undoing spread when a county representative arrived, not at her invitation, but at the homeowner's request. The official had reviewed the case, read the letters, and traced the HOAs creeping over each. Standing on the same driveway where patrol cars had once rolled in on her word, he made it clear, the property lay outside their jurisdiction, their claims carried no weight, and their attempts at forced membership were a breach of state property laws. For a moment, the street was silent. Board members shifted uneasily. A few whispered to one another, their eyes darting between Eleanor and the official. The notary quietly folded their papers, sensing the futility of the display they had been hired to legitimize. Eleanor, however, did not retreat gracefully. Her voice rose, her arguments turned from official to personal. She accused, she speculated, she even suggested the homeowner was a threat to the character of the lake. But the more she spoke, the more her authority unraveled. Her insistence, once intimidating, now sounded desperate. Within days, the ripple became a wave. Complaints were filed, not against the homeowner, but against the HOA itself. Harassment, false claims, misuse of association funds for unauthorized enforcement actions. Homeowners who had long kept their heads down began to voice their grievances. Stories of fines without merit, threats over paint colors, and invasive inspections started to circulate more openly. The narrative Eleanor had built began to crack. The county initiated a formal inquiry, reviewing the association's practices. Several of her board members quietly resigned, unwilling to be dragged further into her vendetta. The newsletter that had once painted the homeowner as a menace now fell silent, its next issue delayed indefinitely as the HOA scrambled to contain the damage. Through it all, the lake remained unchanged, calm, indifferent to the human pettiness that unfolded along its banks. The house at the edge of the road stood as it always had, modest, maintained, quietly steadfast. No banners of victory were raised, no celebrations held, only a quiet relief that the tide had finally begun to turn. Eleanor, stripped of her unquestioned influence, grew reclusive. Her once daily patrols dwindled to brief, bitter glances from her porch. Her dog, still perfectly groomed, now trotted past with less ceremony. The emergency meetings stopped. The fabricated notices ceased. For the first time in years, the neighborhood breathed without her shadow looming quite as heavily over it. By winter, the official investigation concluded with a clear statement. The HOA had no authority over the property, its actions were found to be in bad faith, and restitution would be pursued for the harassment endured. Fines were issued, not to the homeowner, but to the association itself. The lakefront access signs were ordered removed, the fabricated liens dismissed, and the so-called escalation letters declared void. What had begun with a single unwanted letter ended as a cautionary tale whispered from one cul-de-sac to the next. The story spread online, drawing the attention of those who had fought similar battles across the country. It became, for many, a rare example of standing firm and watching over each collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Spring eventually returned to the lake. The trees budded anew, their branches stretching over the water that had been a silent witness to the months of conflict. The house remained outside the HOA, exactly as it had the day it was bought. Its porch light flickered softly at dusk, not as a beacon of defiance, but as a reminder, independence, when lawful and unwavering, can outlast even the loudest campaigns against it. And Eleanor, she was still there, still watching, still insisting, if only to herself, that she had done nothing wrong. But the neighborhood had changed, and the spell she had cast for so long was broken. The lake no longer belonged to her shadow. It belonged to everyone, and it always had. The chapter closed not with confrontation, but with quiet victory. No shouting, no final standoff, only the steady, inevitable unraveling of control when it is pushed too far. The house stood calm once again, the water lapping gently at the shore, and the story of the HOA that called the cops over nothing became just another tale passed around in the long memory of the lake.